They said it was an emergency, a matter of life and death. That's how he began the call, my son, his voice breaking in that carefully measured way people use when they already know you'll do what they ask. Mom, I wouldn't ask if it wasn't serious, he said. And I believed him. Of course I did. He's my only child, the one I held through fevered nights, the one who once refused to go to sleep unless my hand rested on his chest. When someone you love speaks the language of panic, you don't question the grammar, you just move. So I moved. I went straight to the bank, withdrew $5,000, and wired it to him before lunch. I even apologized for not being faster. Thank you, Mom, he said, his tone softening like warm honey. You probably saved my life. And for a moment, I felt that I had. I am 76 now, retired nurse, widow, a woman who has seen enough bodies fail and enough people promise the impossible to recognize when the story doesn't quite add up. Yet I wanted to believe this one. I wanted to be the mother who could still make things right, the woman whose savings could still buy time. He said it was for a hospital bill, an emergency surgery, nothing cosmetic, nothing frivolous. It's serious, Mom, he said again. And that word serious, repeated twice in one call, is what hooked me. I wrote it down on the back of an envelope so I'd remember. Serious. The next morning, I brewed coffee and sat at the table surrounded by unpaid bills of my own, utilities, medication, the little maintenance fees that arrive like gnats. I didn't mind. $5,000 wasn't everything, just enough to cause a pause before I wrote another check. I told myself it was fine. What kind of mother counts interest when her child says he's in pain? 2 weeks later, a neighbor's granddaughter came to help me set up a new phone. She scrolled through the contacts, chatting casually, and said, "Your son's photos keep popping up in suggestions. He looks like he's having fun." I frowned. She turned the screen toward me. There he was, my son, standing shirtless on a small boat, grinning at the horizon. The caption read, "New beginnings. Can't believe she's finally mine." The boat had a name painted in blue letters, Serenity. It was the first time in my life that word tasted bitter. I didn't confront him right away. Maybe it was pride or exhaustion or that strange numbness that settles between shock and anger, like fog over still water. I just closed the phone and said, "He looks happy." The girl smiled. "He should be," she said. "Boats are expensive." I nodded, thanked her, and excused myself. When she left, I sat in the kitchen until the light changed from gold to gray. I didn't cry. Not then. I think nurses learn early that crying doesn't stop the bleeding. Pressure does. So I pressed. The days after blurred together. I watered the plants, changed the bedding, did all the small rituals that keep the world steady when the heart is unmoored. I waited for him to call, to explain, to laugh nervously and say there'd been a misunderstanding. Maybe he borrowed the money for someone else. Maybe the surgery had been canceled and he just celebrated. There are always maybes when you love someone enough to build bridges over oceans of doubt. But the call didn't come. Instead, I saw another post, a picture of him steering the boat, sun behind him, someone's hand on his shoulder, a woman's hand, manicured, young. The caption this time said, "Freedom tastes like salt and gasoline. I remember whispering, almost to myself, and guilt tastes like ash." That night, I walked through the apartment, turning off the lights one by one. Each switch clicked like punctuation. When I reached the bedroom, I stopped by the window and watched the street lamps flicker. A group of teenagers laughed as they passed, their voices rising into the dark like balloons. I wondered if any of them knew what it felt like to be the punchline in your own life. I'd been careful all my years, careful with money, careful with words, careful with my son. And yet, all it took was one sentence, one trembling, "I need you," to undo decades of prudence. I didn't tell anyone at first, not the neighbors, not the women from my bridge club, not even my late husband's sister, who calls every Sunday just to share recipes neither of us will ever cook. Shame has a way of making you quiet. It disguises itself as dignity. I told myself I was protecting him, but really, I was protecting the image of myself as a good mother, the kind who raises honest sons. Weeks turned into a kind of silence that buzzed. Each time the phone rang, I half hoped it was him, ready to say he'd made a mistake, that the boat was a loner, that the surgery was real after all. But it was always someone else, a dentist reminder, a political survey, a polite voice asking for donations. The irony wasn't lost on me. Everyone wanted something, and I had already given too much. One afternoon, I opened the old metal box where I keep my husband's watch and our wedding certificate. The smell of time lives in that box, dust, leather, a faint echo of cologne. Inside was a small envelope marked in my handwriting, for David, if ever needed. I'd written it years ago, before he married, before the lies began, back when the future still felt shared. I tore it in half without ceremony and dropped the pieces into the waste bin. The sound it made was small but final, like a key turning in a forgotten lock. I went for a walk that evening. The park near my apartment was almost empty. A few joggers, a mother with a stroller, a couple sitting too close on a bench. I watched the ducks move across the pond in small, deliberate lines. No rush, no guilt, just quiet purpose. I thought about purpose then, how easily it shifts. Once mine was to heal, then to raise, then to forgive. I wasn't sure what it was now, but it felt like it had finally returned to me. When I came home, the answering machine blinked, his voice again, familiar and foreign at once. "Mom, call me when you get this. I need to explain." I sat at the table and listened twice, then deleted it. Not out of cruelty, but because explanations are just apologies wearing perfume. They smell nice for a moment, then fade. That night, I dreamed of water. Not the ocean, but a still lake at dawn. My son was there, standing on a small dock, waving. The boat was tied loosely behind him, drifting away inch by inch. I called his name, but he didn't hear. The sun rose fast and bright, and for the first time in the dream, I didn't step forward. I stayed on the shore and let him sail wherever the current took him. When I woke, I felt strangely calm. There is a kind of freedom in running out of excuses for someone. It clears the air. It gives shape to silence. I brewed coffee again, stronger this time, and opened the window. The world smelled like rain and beginnings. Somewhere, far away, there was probably a man polishing the deck of his boat, pretending he had earned every shine. And somewhere here, in this small kitchen filled with light and steam, there was me, learning finally that love is not proven by rescue. It's proven by release. The truth arrived quietly, not like a blow, but like a draft, seeping through a closed window. There was no confrontation, no grand unveiling of lies, only a slow rearranging of facts that had been there all along. One morning, as I sorted through the papers on my kitchen table, old bank slips, a few letters, and the receipt from the transfer I had made for my son, I noticed a line of text I hadn't seen before. The note field read, "Payment for personal purchase," not medical assistance, not emergency fee, just those 3 unadorned words that tilted the ground under me. For a moment, I thought there had been a mistake, that the clerk had written something wrong, or my son had simply filled the form in a hurry. But the more I looked at the letters, the plainer they became, as if the ink itself was telling me what I had refused to see. I sat very still for a long while, listening to the refrigerator hum behind me. It's strange how betrayal doesn't come with fireworks. It comes with small domestic sounds, the buzz of an appliance, the tick of a clock, the faint rustle of air when you finally exhale. I wasn't angry, not yet. I was something smaller, thinner, a quiet thread of disbelief holding back a flood I wasn't ready to face. I made tea, because that's what nurses do when they don't know what to do. Heat the water, hold the cup, breathe. Later that afternoon, I went for a walk through the neighborhood, passing the same gardens and driveways I had passed for years, and everything looked the same, but meant something different. I realized I had spent most of my life trusting words. People say things, and you build homes out of them, and sometimes those homes have no walls, just air. The thought didn't hurt. It clarified. The kind of clarity that doesn't announce itself with drama, only with the gentle weight of understanding that you've been living inside someone else's version of truth. The next day, I visited the small marina by the lake. It wasn't intentional, just where my feet led me. The morning was crisp, the air smelling faintly of salt and fuel, and the water carried the reflections of docked boats like mirrors too honest for comfort. I saw one that looked exactly like the picture I had seen on the phone, the same curved hull, the same chipped paint along the edge. For a second, I wondered if it could be his, then realized it didn't matter. What mattered was the feeling of standing there, seeing something that symbolized both freedom and foolishness, and knowing I no longer needed to explain either. I sat on a bench and watched an older man cleaning his boat with the patience of someone who has nothing left to prove. He greeted me, and I nodded back. We didn't talk. Sometimes silence between strangers is kinder than the noise between family. The wind shifted, and the boat ropes creaked softly against the dock, that low, familiar sound of tension meeting weight. I thought about all the years I had carried other people's weight without noticing the strain on my own hands. When I returned home, the mailbox held a single envelope addressed in my son's handwriting. I knew it before I opened it, the slanted letters, the uneven pressure of the pen. Inside was a short note, no apology, just a polite acknowledgement that he'd received the money and would repay it soon. No mention of hospitals or operations, no gratitude that reached beyond courtesy. I folded the letter once, twice, and placed it in a drawer. It wasn't the words that hurt. It was their emptiness. I had read discharge papers with more warmth. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked from room to room, touching objects that had outlasted promises. My husband's watch, the porcelain figurine from our first trip, the photograph of my son at 5, missing a front tooth and holding a toy truck like it was a treasure. I realized I had preserved everything except myself. Somewhere along the years, I had become a curator of other people's moments, careful, dutiful, invisible. That recognition was the true catalyst, not the missing money or the lie, but the sudden awareness that I had been living on the edges of my own story. In the early hours, I sat at the kitchen table with a notebook and wrote my name across the top of the first page, just my name. It looked foreign at first, as if it belonged to someone else, someone I might like to meet again. Then I began listing small truths. I am alive. I can make choices. I am not waiting. It was awkward, childish even, but I kept writing until the page filled. When the sun rose, its light spilled across the counter, touching the cup I had left half full. It wasn't a revelation. It was a beginning. The following days unfolded gently. I stopped checking my phone every hour. I stopped rehearsing conversations I would never have. Instead, I cleaned the apartment, opened the windows, and let the air move through the rooms like forgiveness. Each sound, the curtains shifting, the kettle whistling, felt like a reminder that life continues whether or not we grant permission. One evening, as the sky dimmed to that uncertain blue between day and night, the phone finally rang. His number. I watched the screen light up, the name glowing like an old wound. I let it ring until the sound became part of the room, steady, predictable, and then it stopped. No message, just silence again, softer this time, less like punishment and more like space. That was the moment I understood that endings don't always declare themselves. Sometimes they arrive as choices we don't announce. The decision not to answer, the decision to sleep with the window open, the decision to cook for one without sadness. In that quiet certainty, I felt the shape of my life returning to me, not as a rescue, but as a reclamation. Days later, I walked past a bookstore and saw a sign in the window, Memoirs Workshop, Writing What You Know. I smiled at the timing, at the gentle irony of being invited to write the very thing I had spent decades editing out of my own life. I stepped inside and signed up. The woman behind the counter asked what kind of story I wanted to tell. I said, one where the main character finally listens to herself. She laughed softly. That's a good one, she said. And for the first time in a long while, I believed her. When I got home, the sun was low, painting everything in that forgiving light that makes even the most ordinary things glow. The chipped mug, the dust on the shelf, the reflection in the window that looked a little like hope. I sat down, opened my notebook, and began to write the first sentence. The truth didn't break me, it untied me, and from there, everything began again. It began with small refusals, almost invisible to anyone but me. I stopped answering every call that came too early or too late. I stopped apologizing for silences. I stopped explaining how I spent my days. Each choice felt minor, but together they built a quiet scaffolding of independence, one that rose slowly, almost shyly, around the ruins of the woman I used to be. There was no declaration, no speech in the mirror, only the soft, deliberate act of saying no to noise and yes to stillness. I had spent too many years running to every sound of distress, mistaking it for responsibility. Now, when the phone rang, I waited until it stopped. The world did not end. The first real test came when my son sent a message, just a short text, polite, almost formal. Mom, hope you're okay. Could use a bit of help until payday. No mention of the past, no warmth, only the suggestion of a transaction between two people who used to share a heartbeat. I read it twice, then set the phone down beside the sink where the light caught the screen. For years, I had believed that help was the proof of love, that to deny assistance was to betray the very nature of motherhood. But I was beginning to understand that sometimes love is the refusal to repeat what has already broken you. I turned off the phone, washed the cup, and left the water running just long enough to drown out any hesitation. That evening, I made soup, the kind my husband used to like, thick with vegetables and thyme. Cooking has always been my way of thinking, a rhythm that slows the mind and steadies the heart. As I chopped the carrots, I thought of all the small rescues that had filled my life, rides to airports, last-minute checks, weekends spent mending what others neglected. It wasn't that I resented them. I had simply mistaken usefulness for worth. When the soup was done, I ate it slowly at the kitchen table, savoring not the taste, but the quiet that came with it. The radio murmured softly in the background, old jazz, the kind that sounds like memory more than music. The days that followed carried a strange lightness. I began taking long walks without purpose, letting the city unfold at its own pace. I visited the farmer's market and bought flowers for no occasion, just to see color on my windowsill. Once, I sat on a park bench beside an elderly man feeding pigeons. He talked about the weather and how his wife used to complain that he overfed the birds. I told him that perhaps kindness cannot be measured in handfuls of crumbs. He laughed, and we sat there, two strangers sharing a quiet philosophy. When I got home, I wrote about it in my notebook, the one with my name on the first page. The entry wasn't profound, just a few lines about the sky, the laughter, the way the pigeons lifted together like a single body when startled. But writing it made me feel present in my own life again, as if the act of noticing had become its own kind of salvation. Still, freedom has a way of testing its own edges. One afternoon, as I was watering the plants, my phone buzzed again. Another message from my son, longer this time, apologetic in tone, but vague in content. He wrote about being busy, about trying to get things right, about wanting to talk sometime soon. The words felt rehearsed, polished to sound like sincerity. Yet beneath them, I could hear the familiar rhythm of need. I didn't reply, not out of anger, but out of respect for the silence I was building. I placed the phone face down on the table and stepped outside. The air smelled of rain, heavy and clean. It was enough. A week later, an envelope arrived, his handwriting again. Inside was a folded brochure for a lakeside property development and a short note. Thought you'd like this. Maybe a peaceful place for retirement. I smiled at the irony. He had never visited my home, never seen how peaceful it already was. I tucked the brochure into the recycling bin, but the gesture lingered with me. It wasn't cruelty that stung. It was the assumption that peace was something to be purchased, that serenity came with a price tag and a view. I made a note in my journal that night. They sell the illusion of calm because real calm can't be sold. The following morning, I woke early and decided to visit the community library. It had been years since I'd gone, but the building still smelled of dust and hope, that peculiar scent of paper and quiet ambition. I found a book on late life transitions, something academic and impersonal, yet comforting in its detachment. I sat by the window and read about the psychology of independence, about how identity reshapes itself after decades of caretaking. The author wrote, "There comes a time when the act of standing alone is not defiance, but alignment." The phrase settled in me like a seed. I closed the book, borrowed it, and walked home beneath the soft gray sky. That evening, I rearranged the furniture in my living room, not out of necessity, but to see the space differently. I moved the armchair closer to the window, turned the couch at an angle, and placed a small lamp where the shadows had gathered. When I finished, the room felt larger, though nothing had been added. Sometimes, liberation is as simple as moving what has always been there until it finally fits. As the days turned into weeks, I noticed how silence began to change its texture. It was no longer heavy or punitive. It became spacious, like a room with the door open. I started to sleep better, to wake without that immediate ache of waiting for someone else's need. The mornings came soft and ordinary. Coffee, sunlight, the hum of life continuing. One morning, while sipping my coffee, I realized I hadn't thought about the lost money in days. What I remembered instead was the moment of decision, the exact breath between being asked and saying yes. That breath, I realized, was where my power had always lived. Later, while walking through the park, I saw a woman around my age struggling with a heavy bag of groceries. Without thinking, I helped her carry it to the bus stop. She thanked me, and we laughed about how things seem heavier in the afternoons. It struck me then that generosity doesn't disappear when boundaries appear. It just becomes cleaner, truer, free from the weight of expectation. One evening, I received another message from my son, this time a simple, "Love you, Mom." I read it slowly, felt the familiar tug of tenderness mixed with caution, and answered with equal simplicity, "Take care of yourself." It wasn't rejection, it was release, the kind of release that carries both affection and distance, like the tide retreating from the shore, but still belonging to the same ocean. The next morning, I opened my notebook and wrote, "Healing isn't loud. It's the steady sound of one door closing while another stays gently ajar." Then I poured myself another cup of coffee and watched the sunlight creep across the floorboards. For the first time in years, I felt the quiet thrill of my own company. It wasn't triumph, it was peace wearing its simplest face. As the light shifted, I thought of something I'd once read in a patient's recovery journal decades ago. We don't return to who we were. We arrive where we were always meant to go. Back then, I'd underlined it without understanding. Now I did. The escalations of my life, the arguments, the disappointments, the aching silences were not punishments. They were invitations to begin again. And so I did. It was a late afternoon in early spring when I realized that I was no longer simply surviving the quiet. I was shaping it. The air carried that first hint of green, a kind of shy warmth that doesn't belong to any season, but to the space between them, when the world starts remembering how to bloom again. I had gone to the post office to return a letter, just a utility bill sent to the wrong address, and afterward found myself walking without direction through streets lined with magnolias. Their petals had begun to fall, pale and soft on the pavement, and the sight of them, so delicate yet so sure of their time, filled me with a strange calmness. For months I had been existing like those petals, still attached to what was ending, but that day I felt something inside me loosen, as if the branch had finally let go. When I came home, I didn't turn on the television. I made tea, the same chamomile I used to drink after long night shifts, and sat at the table with my notebook. The page from the last entry waited, filled with careful handwriting that already felt distant. Sentences about silence, about balance, about how it feels to say no. I picked up the pen and wrote something different. Now what? The words looked small, almost fragile, but they were alive. They carried curiosity instead of fear, a question not of escape, but of direction. The next morning, I acted on that question. I visited the community center, a place I had passed hundreds of times without ever entering. Inside, the light was soft, and the air smelled faintly of paper and disinfectant, familiar comforts for someone who had spent most of her life in hospitals. A woman at the front desk looked up with that particular kind of kindness reserved for people who are clearly stepping into something new. "Looking for a class?" she asked. "Something like that," I said. I scanned the bulletin board. Yoga for seniors, watercolor workshops, book clubs, computer basics. My eyes stopped on a small printed sheet, half covered by another flyer. Volunteer companionship program, visiting elders who live alone. There was a phone number and a line that read, "1 hour of your time can change someone's week." I took the slip of paper without hesitation. That same afternoon, I called. The coordinator's voice was brisk but warm. She explained how the program worked, the safety protocols, the visits. It's not about solving people's problems, she said. It's about presence. That word echoed in me. Presence. I had spent so much of my life being available, but rarely present, always doing, fixing, anticipating. Presence felt like something entirely new. I agreed to attend the orientation the following week. The day of the session, I dressed with an attention I hadn't given myself in years. Not vanity, care. I wore my navy cardigan, brushed my hair, and chose earrings that caught the light when I turned my head. The small things that say, I showed up for myself first. The community hall was simple, with folding chairs arranged in a loose circle and a tray of oatmeal cookies on a plastic table. About 10 of us sat there, strangers united by time and willingness. The coordinator, a young woman with calm eyes, talked about empathy, about listening without judgment. Sometimes, she said, people just need proof that they're still visible. Her words landed somewhere deep. I remembered all the times I had been in a room full of people and felt invisible anyway, the way politeness can become a kind of erasure. That day, sitting among strangers, I decided I would not disappear anymore. My first visit came 2 weeks later. Her name was Ruth, 84, living in a small apartment with lace curtains and a parakeet named Leo. When she opened the door, she looked surprised to see me, as though visitors belonged to another lifetime. We sat by her window and talked. At first it was surface talk, weather, the noise from the street, but soon she told me about her husband, gone 10 years now, and how she still caught herself setting a second plate at dinner. I told her about my garden that didn't really exist, just pots on the balcony that I pretended were a garden anyway. We laughed at the shared silliness of it. When I left, she said, "You have kind eyes." And for some reason, that sentence followed me home like a benediction. After that, Thursdays became Ruth's day. I would bring her muffins or just stories from the market. Sometimes we didn't talk much. We'd just sit with tea and listen to Leo chirp nonsense melodies. I began to realize that connection doesn't always demand explanation. You don't have to recount your entire history to be known. Sometimes it's enough to sit with someone who doesn't expect you to perform your pain. One evening, after one of those visits, I walked back along the riverside path. The water reflected the city lights like scattered coins. I thought about how I had come to see value differently, not as something you lend or lose, but as something you carry quietly, intact, regardless of who recognizes it. I had given away pieces of myself for years, and now, giving time to another person without losing anything, I felt richer than I had in decades. At home, I opened my notebook again. I wrote about Ruth, about the parakeet, about the cookies she insisted I take even when I declined. I wrote about how she reminded me of who I might become if I kept choosing stillness over resentment. I wrote until the words no longer felt like stories about other people, but about a version of me I was finally meeting. In the weeks that followed, I added small new habits. I started reading the morning paper again, not for the headlines, but for the crossword. I called an old friend I hadn't spoken to since my husband's funeral, and we laughed like the years between us were only a brief silence. I joined the library's reading club and found myself discussing novels with people 20 years younger who listened to me not as someone's mother, but as a person with opinions. Every conversation felt like a quiet reclamation of space. The shift was not dramatic, but I could feel it in everything. The way I carried my bag, the way I met my reflection in the mirror. There was less apology in my posture, less waiting for permission. My home, once a shelter of routine, had become a studio for possibility. I even moved my husband's watch from the drawer to the nightstand, not as a relic, but as a reminder that life doesn't stop belonging to you after loss. One morning, Ruth called me. "I made extra soup," she said. "Would you come by?" I went, and we ate together, while Leo hopped restlessly in his cage. She said, "I used to think getting older meant losing pieces of yourself, but maybe it just means seeing which pieces stay." I smiled. She was right. The pieces that stayed were the ones that had learned endurance, patience, humor, the ones that had been quiet all along, waiting for their turn. That evening, as I walked home, a light rain began to fall, soft as breath. I didn't hurry. The air smelled of wet earth and the faint sweetness of blooming jasmine. I realized that for the first time in a long while, I wasn't rushing toward or away from anything. I was simply where I was meant to be, walking through my own life with both hands open. When I reached my door, I paused before turning the key. Inside was the same apartment, the same walls, but it felt like it had been gently rearranged by something invisible. Perhaps it was me. I wiped the rain from my face and laughed quietly. It wasn't joy exactly. It was recognition. The midpoint of a life isn't always found on a calendar. Sometimes it's found in a single breath, the one where you stop asking, "Why did this happen to me?" and start whispering, "What can I make of it now?" It happened almost a year after I had started volunteering. Life had settled into a calm rhythm, gentle and deliberate, like the slow turning of pages in a book that no longer surprises you, but still comforts you. The weeks had a shape I could recognize. Mondays were for errands, Thursdays for Ruth, Fridays for the market. I had learned the small pleasures of predictability, how quiet routine can feel like safety after too much noise. But it is often when we begin to trust the quiet that the world decides to test the truth of our peace. The call came on a Sunday afternoon, that kind of soft, drowsy hour when even the sunlight seems to nap across the furniture. I almost didn't answer, thinking it was another charity line or a reminder about the community center's schedule. But something made me pick up. The voice on the other end was hesitant, polite, unfamiliar in tone, yet strangely known in rhythm. "Mom, it's me." I hadn't heard him say that word, Mom, in months. The sound of it landed like a pebble dropped into still water, small but widening in ripples that touched everything around it. I didn't respond right away. "Are you all right?" I asked finally, keeping my voice even. "Yes," he said quickly. "No, I think I am. I was hoping we could talk." The pause that followed was long enough for me to notice the ticking of the wall clock, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the sound of my own breathing. "We're talking," I said gently. He exhaled, relieved but uncertain. "I'm sorry," he said. Just that, 2 words, but they carried 1,000 possibilities. Sorry for what? Sorry for the months of distance? Sorry for the years of misunderstanding? Or simply sorry for being human and fallible, and not the man either of us imagined he'd become? I didn't ask him to clarify. Some apologies lose their meaning when dissected. He told me he'd been thinking about things, about the way we'd grown apart, about how he'd made choices too quickly, trying to prove something to the world. I listened, letting his voice fill the space that had been empty for too long. It wasn't confession, it was reflection, clumsy but sincere. He spoke of wanting to see me, to visit. "Maybe I could drive up next weekend?" he asked. The thought made my heart stumble. For a moment, I saw him as he had been, the boy with scraped knees, the teenager who used to raid the refrigerator at midnight, the young man who once called me after his first heartbreak just to hear me say that things would get better. That version of him still existed somewhere beneath the layers of pride and distance. "All right," I said quietly. Next weekend. When the call ended, I sat for a long time at the table, my hands still resting on the receiver. The sunlight had shifted, painting the room in deeper gold. It wasn't joy I felt, not exactly. It was a cautious tenderness, the kind that comes when you know how easily good things can break. I spent the following days not preparing for his visit, but preparing myself for whatever might come with it. I told no one, not even Ruth, though she noticed something different in me. "You're smiling more these days," she said. "Someone special?" I laughed. Just an old story trying to find a new chapter. When Saturday came, I woke early, the kind of early that belongs to nerves rather than habit. I made coffee, set out 2 cups, and opened the window to let in the smell of morning. The street outside was quiet except for the distant sound of a delivery truck. Around 11, I saw a familiar car pull up, a model I didn't recognize, but a posture I knew immediately, the way he leaned forward over the wheel, cautious and a little impatient. He stepped out, older, leaner, a touch of gray at his temples that startled me. Time had been moving for both of us, even when we weren't looking. He stood at the gate for a moment, uncertain, then smiled awkwardly. "You look good," he said as I opened the door. "So do you," I replied, though we both knew it wasn't entirely true. He looked tired, not in the way that sleep could fix, but in the way that comes from carrying too many versions of yourself at once. Still, his eyes held something softer than before, less guarded. I led him inside. He glanced around, noticing the plants on the windowsill, the stack of books on the table, the framed photograph of me and Ruth at the community picnic. "You've made this place yours," he said. "It's peaceful." "It is," I agreed. We talked for a while, about weather, about work, about nothing that mattered. But beneath the small talk, there was a current of something unspoken. He hesitated often, searching for words, and I let him. Finally, he said, "I know I made mistakes. I've been thinking about how I treated people who cared about me. I thought success meant never needing anyone. Turns out, it just meant being alone in nicer rooms." His voice cracked on the last word. I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. "You're here now," I said. "Sometimes that's all that can be offered." The afternoon stretched gently between us. We ate sandwiches, drank coffee, laughed once or twice about things that weren't even funny but felt necessary. It was almost normal until he said, "There's something else. I wanted to ask for your advice." I braced myself, but his question wasn't about help or money. It was about life, about balance, about how to know when you've hurt someone too much to make it right. "You ask," I said, "and you listen. Then you accept the answer, whatever it is." He nodded slowly. "Even if they don't forgive you?" "Especially then," I said. "Forgiveness is a gift, not a guarantee." As the sky darkened, he stood to leave. We hugged briefly, a little awkwardly, but the contact was real. "I'll call you," he said, and this time I believed he might. After he left, I watched the car disappear down the street, the taillights blinking red against the gray dusk. I felt neither triumph nor loss, only a strange steadiness, like the earth after rain, soft, changed, but still whole. The following weeks unfolded with an unpredictable rhythm. Sometimes he called, sometimes he didn't. There were long silences between his words, but they no longer hurt the way they once had. I had learned to live in the space between connection and solitude. One afternoon, Ruth and I sat in her small living room, listening to the parakeets sing off-key, and she said, "You look lighter." I smiled. "Maybe I am." "Be careful," she said. "Even peace needs maintenance." She was right. Then, one evening in late summer, I received an envelope addressed in his handwriting again. My pulse quickened as I opened it, but inside was no crisis, no plea, just a single photograph. It showed him standing beside a lake at sunset, smiling, holding a fishing rod, his clothes casual and unguarded. On the back, he'd written, "Thought you'd like to see this. I've been spending more time outdoors. Helps me think." Below that, one more line, "I'm trying to be better." I turned the photo over again and studied the light on his face. It wasn't the same as before. It was quieter, less desperate. That night, I placed the photo on the bookshelf next to my husband's watch, not as a symbol of reconciliation, but as a testament to change, the slow, imperfect kind that doesn't arrive with apologies or grand gestures, but with effort and time. I understood then that the test of peace isn't how still life remains, but how gently it bends when the past returns. Autumn arrived early that year. The leaves turned faster than usual, as if impatient to start over. I spent my mornings writing in the notebook that had become my companion, filling pages with reflections about aging, kindness, and the strange elasticity of love. I wrote that love is not something you lose when it disappoints you. It's something that changes its weight until you can carry it again. One afternoon, as I sat by the window watching the leaves drift down, the phone rang. It was him again. "I wanted to tell you something," he said. I started volunteering too. "They have this program for mentoring younger workers. It reminded me of what you do." I felt a warmth spread through me, not pride exactly, but a quiet recognition that the current of care, once broken, can still find another path. We talked for almost an hour. When we hung up, I realized that the tension I had carried for so long had finally loosened, not because he had changed completely, but because I no longer needed him to. That evening, I made soup again, the same recipe as before, but this time, when I set the table, I placed 2 bowls, one for me, one for possibility. I ate slowly, savoring the taste of a day that had asked nothing from me but attention. The world outside was the same, cars passing, a dog barking, the steady pulse of living, yet everything within had shifted. I thought of all the years I had waited for closure and how, in the end, it had arrived disguised as ordinary conversation, as understanding that didn't require victory. When I finished eating, I washed the dishes, wiped the counter, and turned off the lights. In the darkness, I could hear the faint sound of rain beginning again, soft and persistent, the kind that cleans more than it floods. I went to bed with the window open, letting the air carry in the smell of wet leaves. Before sleep took me, I whispered a small thank you, not to anyone in particular, but to the quiet resilience that had kept me standing long enough to see that peace is not the absence of conflict, but the ability to remain gentle within it. Winter arrived quietly, without ceremony, the way real change often does. One morning I opened the curtains and saw that the roofs across the street had turned white overnight, the first snow softening every outline. The city looked younger, as if someone had erased its sharp edges. I stood there for a long time, wrapped in my robe, watching the light gather in the folds of the sky, and thought about how much had happened since the last snow. 12 months earlier, I had lived inside a constant ache. Now I lived inside something slower, steadier, almost tender. Yet beneath the calm, I sensed a movement, the feeling that another threshold was waiting. Life never stops testing the weight of our peace. The phone call came a few days before the new year. I was writing Christmas cards, handwritten notes to a few friends from the community center, when the ring startled me. It was my son again. His voice carried that mixture of hesitation and determination I had learned to recognize. He had something to say and feared the shape of it. "Mom," he began, "I wanted to tell you that I've been offered a job in another city. It's good, really good, but it means moving far away for a while." I waited for the old feeling of abandonment to rise, but it didn't. Instead, I felt a quiet pride. He sounded nervous, almost as if he needed my blessing. "That sounds wonderful," I said. He exhaled, a long, grateful sound. "I was worried you'd think I was running away again." I smiled. "Running away is when you leave without learning. This sounds like moving forward." He laughed softly. Maybe I finally learned something. We talked for a while about practical things, apartments, weather, the cost of flights. Before hanging up, he said, "I'd like to visit once more before I go." And so we set a date, December 29th. When I hung up, I sat in the silence of the living room, the clock ticking in its steady rhythm, and realized that the moment I had once dreaded, the moment when my son would truly step out of my reach, no longer terrified me. It felt like the natural completion of a long lesson. The story between us was not ending. It was finally balancing. In the days leading up to his visit, I felt the old anxiety flutter at the edges of my composure, but it never took over. I baked a simple cake, tidied the apartment, not out of obligation, but out of care for the space that had sheltered my renewal. The morning he arrived, the air smelled of snow again. He brought a small suitcase and an awkward smile, carrying both apology and affection in equal measure. "You didn't have to make anything special," he said when he saw the cake. "I wanted to," I replied. We ate at the kitchen table, the same table that had witnessed every silence and reconciliation between us. After lunch, we took a walk through the park. The pond was half frozen, the ducks huddled in a patch of open water. He told me about the new job, about the city by the ocean, about the view from the office he hadn't even seen yet. His voice carried hope, and for the first time, I felt no urge to warn or protect. I just listened. When we sat on a bench to rest, he turned to me and said, "You know, I used to think you stopped caring, but now I understand you were just giving me space to figure things out." The words struck deep, not because they glorified me, but because they proved he had been listening after all, even during the quiet. "I never stopped caring," I said. "I just stopped rescuing." He nodded, and we sat there watching the snow begin to fall again, the flakes landing on our coats like punctuation marks in a sentence that no longer needed to be rewritten. Back home, he helped me carry the groceries I'd bought earlier. When he placed the last bag on the counter, he said, "I want to pay you back for everything, Mom." I shook my head. "There's nothing to pay back. We both spent what we could. Let's just call it even." He looked at me, surprised. "Even?" "Yes," I said. "Even means we both learned something valuable." He smiled then, a real smile, the kind that reveals the boy inside the man. Later, when he left for the evening, I walked him to the gate. Snow had begun to cover the footprints on the sidewalk. "Take care of yourself," I said. He leaned down and hugged me, brief but firm. "You too, Mom." As he drove away, I stood under the streetlight, watching the taillights disappear into the white haze. The world was utterly still, and in that stillness I felt something settle into place inside me. It was not triumph or forgiveness or nostalgia. It was understanding. The cycle had completed. I had given, lost, learned, and returned to myself. That night, I sat by the window with a cup of tea and looked at the city wrapped in snow. I thought about the years behind me, the long corridors of hospitals, the quiet apartments, the laughter that had faded too quickly, the endless lists of things done for others. For so long, I had measured my worth by what I could give. Now I measured it by how truthfully I could live. I opened my notebook and began to write, not about pain, but about movement, about the seasons that insist on coming back, even when no one invites them. I wrote that endings are rarely explosions. They are often gentle rearrangements of trust. I wrote until the words stopped needing me. As midnight approached, I turned off the lamp and let the moonlight fill the room. Outside, the snow continued to fall, patient and unhurried. The world looked both fragile and infinite. I understood then that the climax of my story was not the moment my son changed, nor the moment I said no or yes. It was this, the quiet certainty that I had finally learned how to remain whole regardless of anyone's arrival or departure. I whispered goodnight to the silence, and the silence, for the first time, whispered back. Spring returned almost without warning. One morning I opened the window, and the air carried that thin sweetness that belongs only to the first days of April, when the ground still smells of last year's leaves, but somewhere beneath, new roots are already pushing upward. I stood there, barefoot on the cool floor, feeling the draft slide across my skin, and thought about how much lighter the world looked. Nothing dramatic had happened, yet everything had changed. I had not rebuilt my life. I had simply started inhabiting it again. The days unfolded gently. My son called from his new city every few weeks, his voice steadier each time. He told me about the sea wind outside his apartment, about learning to cook, about the small circle of friends who reminded him to slow down. I listened without judgment, without the old anxiety that used to tighten around every conversation. The distance between us had stopped being a wound. It had become a kind of horizon, far enough to breathe, close enough to see. Sometimes, when he paused, searching for words, I could hear in his silence the echo of the patience I had finally learned. That was enough. Ruth passed away in late February. I was with her 2 days before, reading aloud from the newspaper while she drifted in and out of sleep. She smiled faintly when I finished the article. "You'll keep visiting, won't you?" she murmured. "I always do," I said, and she squeezed my hand. After the funeral, I walked home through the park where we had once fed the pigeons. The benches were wet from melted snow, the sky pale and thin. I felt no despair, only gratitude that our paths had crossed at the exact moment we both needed proof that companionship can be ordinary and holy at once. That evening, I placed one of her embroidered napkins on my table and lit a candle. The flame trembled a little, then steadied, and I thought, that's how love survives. The community center asked if I would help train new volunteers, and I agreed. Once a week, I stand before a small group of nervous faces and talk about listening. I tell them that compassion is not the same as rescue, that sometimes the kindest thing you can do is to sit beside someone and let silence do its work. They take notes as if these words belong to a manual, but I know they come only from living long enough to understand them. When the sessions end, I walk home slowly, proud not in a grand way, but in the simple awareness that my experience still has use. The apartment has changed too. There are more plants now, a framed photograph of Ruth and me laughing at the picnic, a small watercolor I painted during one of the workshops. I even bought a second teacup, not because I expect company, but because I like the look of balance. One cup waiting beside another, a quiet promise that solitude need not mean emptiness. In the evenings, I sit by the window with a book or my journal, watching the lights bloom across the city. Sometimes, when I see two figures walking together below, I whisper a small blessing for them. May they learn to be gentle before they have to be strong. My son visited again in March, a brief weekend before a business trip. We spent an afternoon cooking, laughing over the mess we made, and later he said, "You seem happy, Mom." I smiled. "I am peaceful. It's better than happy." He nodded, as if he understood. Before leaving, he handed me a postcard of the ocean near his new home. On the back, he had written, "Thank you for letting me find my way." I placed it in my notebook, between the first and last pages, like a bridge joining who I was and who I had become. Now the days grow longer. I wake earlier, make coffee, and step out onto the balcony. The city stirs below, children rushing to school, neighbors greeting each other, the world endlessly repeating its ordinary miracles. I breathe, and for once the future feels neither threatening nor distant. It feels like another room I'm already walking toward. I have learned that the greatest reconciliations are not dramatic. They are simply the moments when you meet yourself in full light and recognize the woman standing there as both survivor and beginner. Sometimes I write letters I never send, to my younger self, to the women I once envied, to the ones who think it's too late to start again. I tell them that recovery is not a miracle, it is a practice. You water the same plant every day, even when it looks dry, and one morning you notice a leaf. You speak kindly to yourself once, then again, until the voice becomes familiar. You learn to stop apologizing for the space you take. These are small things, but together they build a life. Tonight, the sky is turning the color of pearl. I have opened the window again, and the air carries the smell of rain from somewhere far away. I think of all that has been given and taken, all that has been mended without ceremony. I pour tea into both cups and place one opposite me, just for the pleasure of symmetry. The steam rises, pale and graceful, dissolving into the evening light. I lift my cup and whisper a quiet benediction to no one in particular. May we all learn to stay soft in a world that rewards hardness. And with that, I know the story has come full circle, not to an ending, but to a resting place. The world outside hums gently, unchanged yet welcoming. I finish my tea, close the notebook, and let the silence settle around me like a familiar shawl. For the first time in many years, I feel entirely present, entirely whole, entirely home.